Some things aren't lost, they're just waiting for the right soul to hear them again. The rain had started just after dusk, the kind that fell steady and cold, tapping against the windshield like a memory that refused to fade. And Daniel Carter barely noticed it at first, his hands resting loosely on the worn steering wheel of his old pickup as he idled on the side of a narrow dirt road that cut through the edge of a forgotten stretch of woodland somewhere outside a quiet town in northern Vermont, the engine humming low, the headlights casting pale beams across wet gravel and patches of grass that shimmered under the storm's breath. And beside him, Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, still as stone except for the slight twitch of his ears, those sharp, alert movements that Daniel had learned to trust more than his own instincts. Because Rex didn't react to nothing, never had, not in the years they had spent together, not in the desert, not in the long silent miles after, and certainly not now, as his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the reach of the headlights, something buried in the dark that Daniel couldn't yet see. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, his voice low and rough like gravel under tires. But Rex didn't ease. Instead, he let out a short, controlled breath, then another, before suddenly shifting forward, paws pressing against the dashboard, a low sound rising from his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite fear, but something older, something instinctive, and then it came. 3 sharp barks, spaced just enough apart to feel deliberate. A pattern Daniel hadn't heard in years but recognized instantly. The same signal Rex used back when the ground itself could betray you. The same warning that once meant something hidden, something dangerous, something real. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the wheel as his gaze followed the direction of Rex's stare, out past the rain-slick road, toward a patch of uneven earth just beyond a leaning wooden fence, where the grass seemed thinner, darker somehow, as if it had been disturbed long ago and never fully healed. "You hear something?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Rex wasn't listening to sound. He was listening to something deeper, something beneath, and without another word, Daniel killed the engine, the sudden silence settling in like a held breath, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain against metal and glass. He reached for the handle, stepping out into the cold, damp air, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground as he circled the truck. Rex already leaping down beside him with a precision that spoke of training etched into muscle and bone. The dog moved ahead without hesitation, nose low, tail steady, cutting a path through the wet grass straight toward that patch of earth. Daniel followed, slower, his eyes scanning, his mind already turning over possibilities he didn't want to name, the kind that lived somewhere between memory and instinct, the kind that didn't belong to peaceful places. Rex stopped abruptly, paws planted firm as he began to dig, not wildly, not like a dog chasing a scent, but with purpose, each movement controlled, deliberate, dirt scattering in damp clumps as the rain softened the ground beneath him. Daniel crouched beside him, one knee pressing into the cold earth, watching as the hole deepened inch by inch, his breath visible in the chilled air, mixing with the faint metallic scent rising from the soil. And then, just beneath the surface, something caught the light, a dull glint, barely visible through the mud. Daniel reached forward, brushing away the dirt with his gloved hand, and felt it, cold, solid, not rock, not wood, something else, something placed there, not by chance, but by intention. His pulse slowed, not quickened, the way it always did when something didn't feel right, when the world shifted just enough to remind him that some things never stayed buried forever. Rex paused, stepping back slightly, his ears still high, his gaze locked on the spot, as if waiting, not for Daniel, but for whatever came next. And for a moment, in the quiet between the falling rain and the steady rhythm of his own breath, Daniel understood one simple truth. This wasn't random, it wasn't luck, and it wasn't over, not yet. Daniel did not speak for several seconds as his fingers pressed against the exposed surface, brushing away the wet soil slowly, carefully, as if the ground itself might react to impatience. The metal beneath his hand was smooth in some places and rough in others, worn by time, but not by accident. And as more of it revealed itself, the shape became clearer, not a loose object, not something discarded, but a flat plate, rectangular, embedded deliberately into the earth as if it marked an entrance rather than a container. Rex shifted his weight beside him, letting out a low breath again, his eyes flicking between Daniel and the ground, urging without force, waiting without doubt. And Daniel felt that familiar pull in his chest, the quiet tension that came when instinct and memory aligned in a way that logic could not fully explain. He leaned back slightly on his heels, rain tracing lines down the brim of his jacket as he studied the plate more closely. There were faint markings along one edge, nearly invisible beneath the mud, and he wiped them clean with the side of his glove, revealing a series of shallow engravings, numbers and letters that had faded but not disappeared. Military formatting, no question about it. His jaw tightened just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, because things like this did not end up buried in the middle of nowhere without a reason, and they did not stay hidden this long unless someone wanted them forgotten. "All right," he murmured under his breath, more to himself than to Rex, and reached toward the back of his truck. Retrieving a small crowbar from the tool compartment he kept for odd jobs and repairs, the metal felt cold and familiar in his hand, grounding in a way nothing else quite managed anymore. When he returned to the spot, Rex stepped back just enough to give him space, but not enough to disengage, his presence steady, watchful. As Daniel positioned the tip of the bar beneath the edge of the plate, it did not move at first, held tight by years of pressure and packed earth, but Daniel adjusted his angle, applying slow, controlled force, the kind that came from experience rather than strength. And after a moment, there was a faint shift, a subtle release, followed by a sound so soft it almost blended with the rain, a hollow echo rising from beneath the ground. Daniel paused immediately, his breath catching not in alarm, but in awareness, because that sound meant space, not solid earth, not rock, but something beneath, something constructed. He pressed again, and this time the plate lifted slightly on one side, enough for him to grip it with both hands and pull. The weight was heavier than expected, but manageable, and as it came free, he set it aside carefully, revealing a dark opening below, not wide, maybe 3 feet across, lined with aged concrete that descended into shadow, a narrow shaft that swallowed the light from the truck's headlights before it could reach the bottom. Rex stepped forward slowly, lowering his head to the edge, his nose hovering just above the opening as he inhaled deeply, then paused, completely still. Daniel watched him closely, waiting for any sign of distress, but there was none, only focus. Only that quiet certainty Rex carried when something mattered. And then the dog looked back at him, not with urgency, not with fear, but with a calm insistence that felt almost human, as if to say, "This is it. This is what I found." Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting back to the opening, rainwater slipping down into it in thin streams, disappearing into whatever waited below, and for a brief moment, the world around him seemed to fall away, the road, the trees, the steady rhythm of rain, all of it fading into the background as his attention narrowed to that single point in the earth, because deep down, beneath the quiet and the years he had spent trying to leave certain things behind, he knew this was not just something buried. This was something that had been kept, sealed, protected by time and silence, waiting for a reason to surface again, and somehow, against all logic, that reason had found him. Daniel remained still for a long moment, staring into the narrow opening as the rain continued to fall around him, each drop echoing faintly as it disappeared into the darkness below, the sound subtle but steady, like a quiet reminder that whatever lay beneath was real and waiting. He reached into the truck again and pulled out a flashlight, its metal casing worn from years of use, and when he clicked it on, the beam cut through the night with a clean, focused line. He crouched at the edge of the shaft and angled the light downward, the beam revealing a set of narrow metal rungs bolted into the concrete wall, descending into the earth at a steep angle, the surfaces damp but intact, untouched by time in a way that felt almost unnatural. Rex leaned closer, his nose following the light for a second before he stepped back, giving Daniel space again. But his ears remained forward, his body alert, as if listening to something deeper than sound. Daniel adjusted his grip on the flashlight and lowered it further, watching as the light stretched down the shaft, catching on rough concrete, faint stains, and then finally, after what looked like 10 or maybe 12 feet, it reached a flat surface, a floor, enclosed, deliberate, and unmistakably man-made. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a controlled breath that steadied his thoughts, because this was no accident, no forgotten debris. This was structure, design, intention. He placed one hand on the edge of the opening, feeling the cold concrete beneath his fingers, and hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for what he was about to step into. Because places like this carried weight, not just in their construction, but in the stories they held. The kind that did not surface without reason. Rex shifted beside him again, letting out a soft, almost questioning sound, and Daniel glanced at him, meeting those steady amber eyes that had guided him through more than one uncertain path. "Stay close," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. Then he swung one leg over the edge and found the first rung with his boot, testing it carefully before shifting his weight. The metal held, solid despite its age, and one step at a time, he began to descend, the beam of the flashlight moving ahead of him, illuminating each rung before he placed his foot. The air grew cooler as he went down, carrying a faint scent of earth and something older, something sealed away for years. When he reached the bottom, his boots met the floor with a soft, hollow sound, and he straightened slowly, sweeping the light across the space. The room was small, no more than 8 by 10 feet, with low ceilings and bare concrete walls that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed, and in the center of the room sat a single object, a metal case, rectangular, about 3 feet long, positioned carefully as if it had been placed there with purpose rather than abandoned. Daniel stepped closer, his movements measured, the beam of the flashlight steady as it traced the edges of the case. There were markings on it too, clearer than the ones above, stamped deep into the metal, a military designation, partially faded but still readable enough to send a quiet ripple through his memory. He knelt beside it, setting the flashlight down just enough to free one hand, and brushed away a layer of dust from the lid, the sound soft but distinct in the stillness. Above him, he could hear Rex shifting at the opening, nails lightly tapping against the concrete as the dog waited, watching, holding his position like he always did when something mattered. Daniel paused with his hand resting on the case, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm, and for a brief second, time seemed to blur, the past pressing gently against the present, because he had seen containers like this before, not here, not like this, but enough to know they were never empty and never meaningless. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, then reached for the latch, knowing that whatever lay inside had been hidden for a reason, and that once opened, it would not simply be something found, it would be something that changed the shape of everything that came after. Daniel's fingers rested on the latch for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but because something about the silence in that small concrete room felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself understood that a boundary was about to be crossed. He adjusted the flashlight slightly, so its beam fell directly across the case. Then with a steady motion, he released the latch, the metal giving way with a soft, deliberate click that echoed faintly against the walls, the sound, small but final, like a door unlocking after years of waiting. He lifted the lid slowly, careful not to disturb whatever lay inside more than necessary, and for a second, the light caught only darkness, a shadowed interior lined with aged fabric. But as he tilted the lid back further, the contents revealed themselves piece by piece. Not gold, not anything that glittered or shined in a way that demanded attention, but something quieter, something heavier in a different sense. Inside the case were documents, neatly arranged despite the years, sealed in protective sleeves that had yellowed slightly with time, but remained intact. Alongside them lay a folded American flag, its colors muted but still recognizable, the fabric worn at the edges as if it had been handled with care many times before being placed here. Daniel's breath slowed, his eyes moving over each item with a growing sense of familiarity that he could not yet fully explain. He reached in carefully, lifting the top document, the paper firm despite its age, and brought it closer to the light. The ink had faded in places, but the structure remained clear, official formatting, names, dates, coordinates, the kind of information that did not belong to ordinary records. His gaze narrowed slightly as he scanned the lines, and then he saw it, a designation that pulled at something buried deep in his memory, the name of a unit, one he had not heard spoken aloud in years. one that had been mentioned only once. Briefly, during a debriefing that had left more questions than answers, he lowered the paper slightly, his expression still calm, but his mind moving faster now, connecting fragments he had long set aside. Above him, Rex shifted again, a soft whine slipping from his throat, not in distress but in recognition, as if he too could feel the shift in the space below. Daniel set the document aside gently and reached deeper into the case, uncovering more layers. Beneath the papers was a small metal box, no larger than a paperback book, secured with a simple clasp, its surface marked with the same insignia he had just seen. Clearer now, undeniable. He ran his thumb across it, feeling the grooves of the engraving, the edges worn but still precise, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow around him, the present pulling tight against the past, because this was no longer just a hidden place or a forgotten container. This was something connected, something that had been meant to stay buried not because it was lost, but because it had been intentionally removed from the world above. He opened the smaller box slowly, the hinge resisting slightly before giving way, and inside, resting on a bed of dark fabric, was a set of identification tags and a sealed envelope. The tags caught the light faintly, their surface etched with a name, a number, a history reduced to metal and markings. Daniel's hand hovered above them for a second before he picked them up, the weight familiar in a way that did not belong to chance. He turned them over, reading the name once, then again, his breath steady but quieter now, as if speaking might disturb something that needed to be understood first. The rain above continued its steady rhythm, filtering down through the narrow opening in soft, distant echoes, and Rex let out a single, low sound, not a bark, not a warning, but something else entirely, something that felt almost like acknowledgement, as if the dog understood what Daniel was only beginning to realize, that this discovery was not random, not just a buried secret waiting to be uncovered, but a message, preserved carefully through time, waiting for the one person who would recognize its meaning. When the moment finally came, Daniel held the identification tags in his hand longer than he realized, his thumb tracing the engraved letters slowly, deliberately, as if the metal itself could confirm what his memory was beginning to piece together. The name was not unfamiliar, not entirely. It lingered somewhere in the quiet corners of his past, tied to a briefing that had never been fully explained. A name mentioned once and then buried beneath layers of silence and reassignment. He lowered the tags carefully back into the box, his movements controlled, almost reverent, and reached for the sealed envelope beside them. The paper was thick, preserved well despite the years, the edges slightly worn, but the seal intact, unbroken, as if whoever placed it here had intended it to remain untouched until the exact moment it was needed. Daniel turned it over in his hands, the flashlight beam catching faint impressions on its surface, and there, pressed into the paper, was a name written in firm, deliberate script, his own, Daniel Carter, the letters unmistakable, not printed, not stamped, but written by hand. His breath slowed again, not in shock, but in a quiet, steady disbelief that settled deeper than any sudden reaction ever could, because things like this did not happen without intention, without design, and the idea that this had been placed here, waiting specifically for him, shifted something inside him that he had not felt in a long time, something that felt almost like purpose. Above, Rex let out a soft bark, a single note that echoed down the shaft, not urgent, not alarmed, but acknowledging. As if the dog understood that something had just changed, Daniel glanced upward, briefly, then back to the envelope, his fingers resting along the edge of the seal, and for a moment, he hesitated, not out of fear of what might be inside, but out of respect for the weight it carried, because once opened, whatever message it held would move from the past into the present, and there would be no returning it to silence. He exhaled slowly and broke the seal, the sound soft but distinct in the stillness of the room. He unfolded the paper inside carefully, revealing a single page, filled with handwriting that remained clear despite the years, and as he began to read, the world around him seemed to narrow once more, the concrete walls fading into the background, the sound of rain above dimming into something distant and irrelevant. The words were direct, not long, but precise, written by someone who understood time was limited and clarity mattered. It spoke of a mission that had never been recorded officially, of a decision made outside of orders, and of something hidden. Not to protect a secret of power, but to protect the truth from being lost. Daniel's eyes moved steadily across each line, absorbing the meaning piece by piece, and with each sentence, the fragments in his memory aligned more clearly. The unit name, the unexplained absence, the quiet reassignment that followed. It had never been random, never been a gap in the system. It had been a choice, and now, years later, that choice had found its way back to him. He lowered the paper slightly, his expression unchanged on the surface but steadier, more grounded beneath, as if something that had been unsettled for a long time had finally found its place. Rex's presence above remained constant, a quiet anchor. In the shifting moment, and Daniel understood something simple but undeniable. This was not just a discovery, not just something buried and uncovered by chance. This was a message carried across time, delivered through loyalty and instinct. And whatever came next would not be about what was found, but about what he chose to do with it. Daniel read the letter again, slower this time, letting each word settle into place not just in his mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that had carried unanswered questions for years without ever expecting resolution. The handwriting remained steady from beginning to end, no hesitation in the strokes, no doubt in the message. Whoever had written it had known exactly what they were doing and exactly who would one day be standing here reading it. The letter spoke of a choice made during a mission that had never made it into official records, a moment when orders and conscience had diverged, and someone had chosen to protect something that could not be explained through reports or commands, something that would have been buried in silence if left in the wrong hands. Daniel lowered the paper slightly, his eyes lingering on the final line. A sentence that felt less like an explanation and more like a passing of responsibility. Not a burden, but a trust. Above him the rain softened, the steady rhythm easing into something lighter, almost distant, as if the storm itself was beginning to move on. Rex shifted again at the opening, his silhouette barely visible against the dim light above, but his presence remained constant, grounded, and Daniel could almost feel the quiet certainty that had guided the dog to this exact place. He folded the letter carefully along its original lines and placed it back into the envelope, not sealing it, but resting it gently inside the metal case alongside the other contents, his movements precise, deliberate, as if the act itself carried meaning beyond simple organization. He then picked up the smaller metal box once more, weighing it slightly in his hand before setting it back into place. Nothing here felt like it belonged to the past anymore, not in the way forgotten things usually did. This was not abandoned. It had been preserved, protected, waiting for a moment that had now arrived. Daniel stood slowly, the low ceiling forcing him to straighten with care, and turned his flashlight toward the walls of the room again, this time noticing details he had overlooked before, faint markings along the concrete, not random, but intentional. Lines and symbols that seemed to map something, not a location, but a sequence, a path of decisions rather than directions. He stepped closer, tracing one of the lines with the beam of light, his mind aligning the shapes with what he had just read, understanding forming not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet unfolding. This was not just a place to hide objects. It was a place to preserve meaning, to ensure that what mattered would not be lost to time or misinterpretation. He turned back toward the opening above, the light catching the falling rain as it slipped through in thin strands. And for a moment, he allowed himself to stand still, to feel the weight of where he was and what he had found. Not overwhelming, not heavy in the way the past had often been, but steady, grounding, as if something that had once been fractured had now found alignment. Rex let out a soft sound again, a low breath that carried no urgency, only presence. And Daniel nodded slightly, more to himself than to the dog, then stepped toward the rungs and began to climb, one hand steady on the cold metal, the other holding the flashlight, the beam shifting upward. With each step, the distance closing gradually until he reached the surface, the cool night air meeting him as he pulled himself back onto the wet ground, the world above unchanged in appearance yet different. In a way that could not be seen, Rex stepped forward immediately, pressing lightly against his side for a brief second before stepping back, his eyes searching Daniel's face as if confirming something unspoken. Daniel looked down at him, the faintest hint of something softer crossing his expression, not relief, not surprise, but recognition, and as the rain continued to fall gently around them, he understood that whatever had been set in motion beneath the earth had not ended when he closed that case. It had only just begun to take shape in the world above. Daniel stood beside the open patch of earth for a long moment, rain settling into a fine mist that clung to his jacket and dampened the edges of his hair, the world around him quiet in a way that felt almost intentional, as if the night itself had shifted to accommodate what had just taken place. Rex remained close, his posture relaxed now, but still attentive, his gaze moving between Daniel and the ground as though keeping watch over something no longer hidden but not yet fully revealed. Daniel exhaled slowly and stepped toward the truck, his boots pressing into the softened soil with a steady rhythm, not hurried, not uncertain, just deliberate. As if each step carried the weight of a decision already made, he reached the open door and paused, resting one hand against the frame, his eyes drifting back to the place where the metal plate now lay beside the exposed opening, rainwater sliding across its surface in thin, reflective streams. And for a brief second, the thought crossed his mind to close it, to return everything to the way it had been, sealed, silent, untouched. But the idea faded just as quickly as it came, because some things were not meant to be hidden again once they had been found. Rex trotted over and stopped beside him, looking up with that same steady expression, and Daniel gave a small nod, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement, then reached into the cab and pulled out a folded tarp and a length of rope. Simple things, practical, the kind of tools that turned intention into action. He walked back to the opening and secured the tarp loosely over it, anchoring it against the rain, not to conceal, but to protect, to hold the space until he could return with clearer purpose. When he finished, he stood again, looking down at the covered ground, the shape of it still visible beneath the fabric, and something in his posture shifted, not outwardly dramatic, but enough to mark a change, a quiet alignment between what he had found and what he understood needed to come next. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the identification tags, the metal cool against his palm, and turned them once more in the faint light. The name etched into them no longer just a fragment of memory, but a connection, a thread that had led him here through time and chance, and something else he could not quite name. Above the steady hush of rain, the sound of distant tires approached along the road, faint at first, then clearer, headlights cutting through the darkness as a vehicle passed by slowly, its presence brief but grounding. A reminder that the world beyond this moment still moved forward, still existed beyond what had been uncovered in the earth. Daniel slipped the tags back into his pocket and turned toward the truck, Rex already moving ahead, his gait calm, confident, as if whatever question had guided him here had now been answered in a way that satisfied something deeper than instinct. Daniel climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the familiar vibration filling the cab, steady and real. He let it idle for a moment, hands resting on the wheel as his eyes lingered on the road ahead, not searching, not uncertain, but focused in a way that felt new. Not because the path was clear, but because the direction mattered again. Rex settled into his seat beside him, head slightly raised, ears relaxed but aware, and as Daniel shifted the truck into gear and eased back onto the narrow road, the rain continued to fall softly around them, the covered ground fading into the distance behind, but not into the past, not entirely, because some discoveries did not stay where they were found. They followed, quietly, shaping what came next in ways that could not be undone, and as the headlights stretched forward into the dark, Daniel understood that whatever had been waiting beneath the earth had not only been uncovered, it had chosen its moment, and in doing so, it had chosen him. The road stretched long and quiet beneath the steady glow of the headlights, the rain easing into a soft drizzle that clung to the windshield in scattered patterns, and Daniel drove without turning on the radio, without reaching for anything to fill the silence. Because for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if something unseen had settled into place beside him, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present. Rex rested calmly in the passenger seat, his breathing slow and even, his earlier tension gone, replaced by a quiet assurance that seemed to mirror the shift in Daniel's own thoughts. The truck moved past stretches of dark forest and occasional dimly lit houses set back from the road, each one passing like a distant memory, untouched, separate from the path he now found himself on. And after several miles, Daniel slowed as he approached a small town, the kind that held on to its lights even in the late hours, a single gas station. Glowing softly at the corner, its sign flickering faintly against the damp night air, he pulled in without hesitation, the tires crunching lightly over gravel as he parked beneath the canopy, the engine idling for a moment before he turned it off, the quiet returning in a different form now, shaped by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of rain tapping against the metal roof above. He sat there briefly, hands resting on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, as if allowing the moment to settle before taking the next step. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching him with calm attention, and Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out the envelope once more, the paper now carrying a different weight than it had just an hour before. Not unknown, not uncertain, but defined. He stepped out of the truck and crossed toward the payphone mounted along the side of the building, its surface worn from years of use, a relic in a place that had not yet let go of simpler ways. The receiver felt solid in his hand as he lifted it, the faint dial tone steady and clear, and for a second, he hesitated, not because he did not know who to call, but because making the call would move everything forward in a way that could not be reversed. He glanced back toward the truck, where Rex now sat upright, watching through the window, steady, unwavering, and Daniel nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of the path already chosen. He reached into his memory and dialed the number carefully, each digit deliberate, the line ringing once, then twice, before a voice answered on the other end, calm, older, carrying the kind of tone that suggested experience without needing to prove it. Daniel spoke simply, giving his name, nothing more, and for a brief pause, there was silence, not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition, as if the name itself carried meaning that had been waiting to surface again. The conversation that followed was short, precise, and quiet. No unnecessary words, no explanations spoken aloud, only confirmation, a location, a time, and a single instruction. That felt less like an order and more like an understanding. When Daniel hung up, he stood there for a moment longer, the receiver still in his hand, listening to the faint hum of the disconnected line. Then he placed it back carefully and returned to the truck, the night air cooler now, the rain nearly gone. Leaving behind a clarity that had not been there before, he climbed back inside, the seat familiar, grounding, and started the engine again. Rex shifted slightly, but remained calm, his gaze forward, as if already aware that the journey had taken on a new direction. Daniel pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the thinning mist, and as the town lights faded behind them, the sense of movement returned, not just in distance, but in purpose, because what had been uncovered beneath the earth was no longer just a secret preserved in silence. It had become a call answered, a connection restored. And as the road carried them forward into the quiet dark, Daniel understood that whatever awaited ahead was not something he had to search for. It was something already set in motion, something that had been waiting not just to be found, but to be completed. The highway stretched into the early hours of morning, the sky beginning to shift from deep charcoal to a muted shade of blue that hinted at the coming light. And Daniel drove steadily, his hands firm on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead not with urgency, but with a calm sense of direction that had not been there before. The night had changed something in him, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but quietly, like a door opening in a place he had forgotten existed. Rex rested beside him, his head lowered now but his ears still alert, rising slightly with each subtle change in the world outside, as if even in rest he remained connected to something deeper than sight or sound. After several hours, the road narrowed, leading them away from the main highway and toward a stretch of land that felt older, less touched by time. Tall trees lined the path, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the early light into soft, scattered beams. And at the end of that road, a simple gate stood, open, weathered wood, unmarked except for a small metal plate that bore no name, only a number that matched the one Daniel had been given over the phone. He slowed the truck and drove through without hesitation, the tires crunching lightly over gravel as the path curved gently toward a clearing. There, set against the backdrop of quiet forest, stood a modest building, not large, not imposing, but solid, intentional. A place built to endure rather than impress. Daniel parked and turned off the engine, the silence settling around them in a different way now. Not empty, not distant, but expectant. He stepped out, the cool morning air brushing against his face, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Rex followed immediately, moving at his side with the same steady presence he had carried through every step of the journey. The door to the building opened before Daniel could reach it, and an older man stepped out, his posture straight despite the years, his expression calm but attentive, as if he had been waiting not just for someone, but for this exact moment. They stood facing each other for a second that felt longer than it was, recognition passing between them without the need for explanation. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the envelope and the identification tags, holding them out without a word. The man accepted them carefully, his hands steady, his gaze lowering briefly to the items before returning to Daniel's face. And in that look, there was something that resembled both relief and closure, as if a piece of something unfinished had finally found its way home. No questions were asked, none were needed, because the truth had already been carried, preserved, and delivered exactly as it was meant to be. The man stepped aside and gestured toward the building, an invitation not forced, not expected, simply offered. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before shaking his head slightly, not in refusal, but in quiet understanding that his part in this had already been fulfilled. Rex stood beside him, still and calm, his gaze moving briefly toward the open doorway before returning to Daniel, and the man nodded once, as if acknowledging a decision that did not need to be explained. Daniel turned back toward the truck, the morning light growing stronger now, illuminating the clearing in soft gold. And as he reached the driver's door, he paused, looking back once more at the building, at the man standing there, and at the space between them that no longer held uncertainty, only completion. He climbed into the truck and started the engine, the sound steady and familiar, Rex settling into his place beside him without hesitation. And as they drove away, the path behind them faded gradually into the trees, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer waiting, because some things are not meant to be kept forever, only carried until the moment they can be returned. And as the road opened once more beneath the rising light, Daniel understood something simple and certain. He had not been looking for meaning when Rex began to dig into the earth that night. But sometimes meaning does not ask to be found. It waits patiently beneath silence and time until loyalty brings it back into